Welcome to your Innovation Coffee Break with 500 Startups. In order to better understand how innovation teams, investors, and founders are dealing with this time of uncertainty, 500 Startups is kicking off a new series called Innovation Coffee Breaks. So pour yourself a cup of Joe and join me today. My name is Vijay Rajendran. I'm 500 Startups Director of Innovation and Partnerships, and every week I'll be joined by top experts from leading companies, venture capital firms, and from the startup community as well. 500 is a venture capital firm discovering and backing the world's most talented entrepreneurs, helping them grow and build thriving global ecosystems. Today, we are thrilled to kick off the series with Alex Lazarow, Investment Director of Cathay Innovation. Alex, welcome to Innovation Coffee Break.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. To begin, Alex, can you tell us a little bit about your background and career and what you do at Cathay Innovation?
Yeah, happily. So, by day, I'm a venture capitalist. I work for a fund called Cathay Innovation. Cathay is the name of China and Marco Polo's day. So this idea of East meets West. We're a globally focused fund, 500 million euro, a third of it invested in Asia, out of Singapore, Shanghai, Beijing, a third pan-Europe, out of Paris, which is our headquarters, but also across the continent. A third of this notional rest of the world, mostly North America, out of San Francisco. About 40% of our capital comes from global corporates, companies like Total, Michelin, BNP Paribas, among others. We invest Series A through C, $5 to $20 million checks, a mix of lead and follow. And we're affiliated with a private equity fund called Cathay Capital, which has been around for about 15 years, has about $4 billion under management, 8 offices around the world. Does global cross-border private equity. So that's my day job. And outside of work, I have been teaching entrepreneurship at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies, which is Middlebury College's graduate program down in Monterey. And I tell you this just to share a little bit about my side project and my hobby. And one of the things that we'll talk a little bit about today, which is, while teaching my class, I was getting really frustrated that I kept assigning my students books about entrepreneurship. And they're excellent books, and it's books on how to grow, how to build your team, what have you. But everything I assigned my students, I felt like I had to contextualize to the reality of building startups in more emerging ecosystems. Most of my students were moving back home to the Midwest or moving to an emerging market to build their startup. And I thought, and I believe, that the best entrepreneurs operating in Chicago or Detroit or Amsterdam or Bangalore or Nairobi have more in common with the best entrepreneurs in Sao Paulo than they do with those in San Francisco. And yet no one was telling their stories. And I went out and I interviewed about 200 entrepreneurs, mostly entrepreneurs that are leading some of this next wave's hottest companies around the world, $200-300 million valuations, all the way to a couple $1 billion who have exited. But primarily in ecosystems outside the Valley. And the culmination of that is coming out on Tuesday. It's called Out Innovate, how global entrepreneurs from Delhi to Detroit are rewriting the rules of Silicon Valley. It's a book coming out by Harvard Business Review Press. And so that's the total of what I'm working on.
That's amazing. Yeah. And very exciting to see all of that synthesized in your book. And I'd love to dig deep into some of those topics today. Certainly the world is wondering what kind of founders will be successful in a post-COVID operating environment. Your book suggests that blitz scaling doesn't work in other parts of the world, and unicorns should be replaced with what you describe as camels. Can you explain why camels and what are they and why they may be desirable?
It's amazing how there's a beautiful menagerie of animals out there to describe startups, and we have unicorns of camels. I've heard of the zebras, the cockroach, and what have you. But let me tell you why I chose to talk about camels. In the Valley, we have this modus operandi of how to build a startup. And the unicorn is not just the objective, right? You think of a $1 billion company, it's also the philosophy. And if the philosophy is to chase unicorns, the method is growth. And it translates to an approach of growth at all costs, and it's okay to subsidize user acquisition. Burn is at some of the highest levels it's been. And obviously, I've been working on this book for 2 years. The context has changed a little bit in the last 2 months. But around the world, the context is different, and there's less capital, there's less depth of trained startup human capital, the been there, done that army that the Silicon Valley has. And often it's an ecosystem that is more susceptible to macroeconomic shocks, particularly in emerging markets. And so the reason I chose the camel is, for one, it's a real animal. It doesn't live in fictitious lands. It can still sprint when it needs to. It drinks water faster than almost anything, but it can survive the world's harshest environments. And the idea is that entrepreneurs outside the valley are obviously still trying to grow, and they're obviously trying to build massive businesses that benefit from enviable network effects, but also they're building it from a position of infusing the business with sustainability and resilience from day one. And so what does that mean? One, it is about thinking very carefully about the unit economics of the business and make sure you're not subsidizing acquisition, you're charging for the value you create. One of my favorite examples, a company in Zambia called Zona, their motto is easy, quick, safe. They offer mobile money in Zambia. It's not free or cheap. It's easy, quick, safe. And that's the value they charge for, and they actually are premium service. The second is managing costs and managing burn. And the third is taking a long-term view. The case of Grubhub is actually a really interesting example. We think of on-demand delivery as one of these models that's received a lot of venture capital. This business was built out of Chicago, raised what many would consider a paltry amount of VC, less than $100 million. And every single one of the fundraisers, when I was interviewing Mike Evans, the co-founder, he talked about how they were sustainable, how they were break even at those fundraisers. And taking the long-term view, he told me he could have done it in 2 less years, but we would have done it at materially more risk. So it's infusing the business with resilience and sustainability. And so, Vijay, to answer your question about why it matters today, obviously in the Valley and around the world, the context has changed. And I think that now we're all trying to figure out how to build businesses that can succeed over the long term, but also manage through adversity that we're going through. And I think that where we're going to see the lessons won't be from the ecosystem that has thrived in a context of abundance, but will be from entrepreneurs that have already had to do this as a day-to-day business. Obviously, the situation we're going through is exceptional, but building at the frontier, what I call the frontier, and ecosystems that are more challenging, is par for the course. And I think that's where we're going to learn some of those lessons.
Yeah. To build that kind of sustainable early on venture, do you need to focus on a hyper-local market, or can you still have global aspirations from day one?
Yeah, this is such an interesting question, and one where I'll probably give you a very unsatisfying answer, because it depends obviously on the business and the go-to-market. But here's one thing that I've seen pretty consistently to your point, your question around being global, is in many ways, the constraints that entrepreneurs operate in are often turned into advantages. And what I've observed is that in many markets outside the Valley, entrepreneurs are born global. And they are starting their business in a smaller market. And 500 startups, you guys know about this firsthand with your funds all around the world and in many emerging markets. If the local market is smaller, it means that the opportunity must be much bigger by becoming global. And we're seeing entrepreneurs building born global companies from the get-go. In Southeast Asia, among the unicorns, 7 out of the top 10 are pan-regional. And among the others, they're really focused on Indonesia, which is the biggest market in stand. You could build a business that is massive and stand on its own in one market. And so this ability to build a born global business is obviously an additional constraint that you have to do it, but it challenges entrepreneurs and businesses to build a culture, an organization, and a product that can scale across borders. And that's a powerful skill set.
For sure. Now, to build that kind of organization, you're also now trying to do that in a current state, but probably a future state as well, that involves remote work and distributed teams. Does that accelerate or decelerate the kinds of companies that we'll need to see, the camels?
Yeah. So two separate points. I think the first is around the camels. I think this definitely will be a movement that will accelerate our demand for camels, businesses that have sustainable unit economics, gross margins that work, a burn that gives longevity, and that gives optionality to get to points of sustainability when you need to. So I think definitely that'll be a catalyst for it. But your second question about distributed teams, I think that's really interesting. I mentioned Born Global from a TAM perspective and in the markets that they're operating, but the equal dimension to that is in many markets where I think talent is distributed evenly. Unfortunately, opportunity is not. And in many markets, there isn't the same. If you have a very specialized resource you're looking for, like a CMO that's been there, done that, scaled a company to IPO. Outside of the Valley, in many ecosystems, I grew up in Winnipeg, there aren't 15 of those people. They've done that for a tech company. And so founders that are operating in more emerging ecosystems, by necessity, often look outside their ecosystems and build distributed teams. And so, my Twitter feed is exploding with everyone showing me their fancy Zoom rigs here in the Valley. But building distributed teams has often been par for the course for many startups outside the Valley since the get-go. And as we're doing this big shift towards distributed work, this is an area where it's no surprise to me that some of the leaders in the US, for instance, you think of Basecamp in Chicago, or Zapier with its roots in Missouri, and many of the others, they've really built this, having been built outside the Valley. They've had to build this as a muscle. And now we can learn from their best practice around doing this successfully.
That's really exciting. Yeah, it's great when we can adopt best practices from elsewhere in the world. We definitely have much to learn in the Valley. This isn't the sole source of all expertise.
Yeah, and by the way, your point is really interesting of like learning for us in the Valley. What I have observed is that in the past, learning, entrepreneurs outside the Valley, you think of eBay in the old days, right? Like eBay, born in the Valley, was copied and replicated around the world. And I think we still have this mistaken belief that that's the way innovation works, right? It comes from a couple of small centers and it gets copied. What I believe is happening today is actually there's learning in bi-directions. And so take ride sharing, for instance. Uber, Lyft pioneered the model here in the Valley. We saw that model get replicated all over the world, right? And China's model and Didi's size dwarfs Uber and all the others. But it also got adapted in ways. Think of what happened in Indonesia with Gojek, right? It got adapted to ride sharing on Ojeks, on little motorcycle taxis. And the CEO, Nadeem, thought about the ride sharing business differently. He thought about the drivers as an ecosystem. And in the mornings, he wanted to drive people to work. At lunch, he wanted to deliver food. After work, he wanted to drive them home. At night, he wanted to deliver food. In the middle, it would be a range of other services like e-commerce delivery or mobile money. And adapted it to a super app model, in some ways borrowing from what happened in China. And it's no surprise to me, by the way, that now in the US, Uber has Uber Eats and Uber has an Uber credit card. And so to your point, Vijay, around learning, I think that we in the Valley have an opportunity to learn a lot from what's happening in emerging markets or at the frontier. But I actually think this learning will be bouncing back and forth more and more because there's going to be these centers of excellence all over the world.
I couldn't agree more, particularly if you consider how other societies are leapfrogging many of the legacies that we have here.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And if you think about it, the world leader at mobile banking on feature phones is probably in Kenya. One of the biggest digital banks is in Brazil, Nubank. Some of the leaders around super apps are obviously in China. India is now inspiring a lot of new models. They're getting replicated. So we're seeing this pop over in different ecosystems in different ways.
Mm-hmm. And to build that, it means that startups have to build either the full stack or a bigger stack than maybe we would be accustomed to in the US or many other markets like the Valley. I'm curious, what does it mean to have to build the full stack rather than just the microservices or the application layer?
Yeah, this is one of these examples of having to operate within a situation of constraints. In the book, I talk about one company, Guia Bolsa, which is in Brazil, which is trying to build the Mint.com of Brazil. Mm-hmm. And so you think of like Mint.com in the US, we have the Yodlee layer or Plaid for the bank interconnection layer. That didn't exist in Brazil. So the first thing they had to do is build that. Mint.com can offer people a set of loans and better options. The challenge is in Brazil, there isn't at the time, there wasn't a nationwide FICO. There was kind of you're either in default or you're not, blacklist credit system. Mm-hmm. And so they had to build a way for consumers to understand their credit. And in some ways had to layer on something at the intersection of what Credit Karma / a FICO might be to help customers understand it. And there wasn't an ecosystem of fintechs or banks that are willing to lend either, which is the way that a lot of the PFM players in the US have been able to monetize. And so they've had to build their own kind of white label platform to bring others in and facilitate it. And so to be able to offer justthemint.com had to build a set of other services on top. And that's what I mean by the full stack, is that unfortunately you have to build more than one business to be able to do everything. The rise of e-commerce in emerging markets is a great example, right? Think of Flipkart in India. Like for Flipkart to succeed, it wasn't just an e-commerce player. They had to do cash on collection, cash on delivery, logistics, and a whole range of other services that were not required. You know, obviously Amazon has built into this already, but they didn't have to build it from day one. A lot of these businesses have to build the full stack. There is one other dimension to that, which I think is interesting, which is there is this vertical stack, but there's also a phenomenon around building an ecosystem of activities. We're seeing a lot of startups build not just the one product, but an ecosystem around it to fill institutional voids. And that's another dimension of it that I think is underappreciated.
Oh, absolutely. You know, when we think about these startups building all these businesses around them to augment and create more value for their customers, it's remarkable that incumbents haven't like seen that happening and thought like, oh, they're coming onto our turf. More likely they write off the startups as insignificant. Are there any cautionary tales you think for incumbents, and is there something that like leaders in big companies and institutions can take away from this?
Yeah, one of the things that I think is interesting is in the Valley, we have this notion of how corporates work with VCs and with the acquisition or investment model. And one of the things that's happening out of Asia is much more of this ecosystem approach that corporates are working with startups. And so think of Tencent and Alibaba, who are not only investing in startups, but actually through the WeChat ecosystem or through Alipay or others are actually really helping scale the startups in the ecosystem. It's a little bit of a hybrid of, it's not pure investing, it's not pure acquisition, but it's really bringing to the fold. And so we're seeing more, I'm seeing that. Obviously that's happening in China, but it's happening more and more in Southeast Asia as well. And one of the things that I'm pretty excited about is how can corporates think about that model over time and infuse some of their businesses with that. So I believe for corporates, there's obviously this threat narrative, but I actually think there's a big opportunity narrative as well to reinvent and reinvigorate businesses. And that's one of the ways that it might be possible.
That's awesome. I couldn't agree more. I have one final question, and then we'll have to leave it there. We're
the final question. Okay, I'm ready.
The final sip. And, you know, we both work for VC firms, but I have to ask, you know, in the context of, you know, what is happening around the world, are there also some good alternatives to venture capital? And do you have any predictions of how funding companies will be different in the future?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I find it suspect that in our coffee chat, I haven't seen you drink your coffee at all. But yeah, so my students I often ask my students, you know, where do they think the venture capital model came from? And they'll often say, oh, like, you know, it was invented in Silicon Valley for venture capital and to fund startups. But the reality is its roots are much older. Mm-hmm. The venture capital model emanated from the whaling industry and was adapted to what we have now. And one of the reasons it's called carried interest is it used to be literally what you carried off the boat. And that model has worked extraordinarily well for a particular context and for a particular type of startup. But in many parts of the world, the context is different. And if you fast forward, I believe, you know, today there's 480 startup ecosystems around the world. And I believe that if you fast forward, many of these ecosystems are going to rise and innovation will look different. And the types of businesses, it'll be not just the high growth startup, one Silicon Valley model. There's going to be a lot of different models. And as a result, there's going to be a lot of different ways to support those entrepreneurs. And venture capital is going to continue being one way. And, you know, in full transparency, I'm a VC and I think it's an incredible tool for a particular type of startup. But I think there's going to be other tools that will work as well. And so I'll give you 3 areas that I think are interesting. The first is reinventing this whaling model with something else. Another industry you might have imagined would have been the mining industry, which also funds high-risk ventures. And if you adapt that model, you might get a revenue share, which is like a royalty. And we're seeing a bunch of companies, some funds getting built like that, and startups getting built to do that. The second is thinking a little bit about the structure of the fund. The 2 and 20, 10-year fund works well, but if timelines are longer, are there ways that you can actually take a longer term view? And I think Naspers is a good example out of South Africa, and arguably the most successful venture investment in history when they invested in Tencent, held it for 2 decades. And today their $150 billion market cap is $100 billion of which is them, is the Tencent investment. And so, are there ways that you can take a little bit of a long-term approach on these mega ideas? And the third is, are there other ways, other tools to invest and assess companies? And one of the things that's interesting in this moment of Corona is that I'm taking all these meetings with entrepreneurs from all over the world. And Zoom is an incredible leveler. It doesn't matter if you're in San Francisco or in North Dakota or in Winnipeg or wherever, the meeting experience is equal. I think there's a lot of tools like that that are great levelers. And one that I think is exciting is computerized decision-making, where you can ingest a lot of the information and make an impartial decision on whether or not the company. That obviously isn't the whole decision of a business. I think interpersonal fit, values, fund fit, all that matters. But I think this is going to be a part of the decision that will become increasingly important and will be increasingly powerful at giving voice and increasing diversity in the venture industry, because then it just doesn't matter what your network is. It just matters what your performance is. And so those are 3 areas that I'm particularly excited about how venture will change. And hopefully some of these will be incorporated in, but also will give rise to different models for different types of companies.
What a great note for us to end on. Yes, venture capital itself finally innovating. Alex, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been an exciting conversation. We look forward to the book dropping, and folks can pre-order it now, right? Yeah, so the book is Out Innovate, How Global Entrepreneurs from Delhi to Detroit Are Rewriting the Rules of Silicon Valley, and it's available on Amazon and every other major bookseller. And if you want to follow me, you can sign up for my newsletter at alexlazarow.com or on Twitter at alex_Lazarow. You want to follow him and subscribe to his newsletter. Thanks, everyone, and see you next week. Take care. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.